All right, bet. So we had three inquiries on the table for your breakout room discussions. One, what is the thesis? Two, what are your thoughts on the goals of the discipline of Black Studies? And finally, what stood out most to you as it pertains to the reading? Does anyone want to share what was discussed in the breakout room?
Yeah, I can discuss. I think as far as one of the first things that we all kind of agreed on was the importance of Black studies, and I would say, also touching on the goals. And I think, one of those goals is really uh, finding a kind of a common ground where, depending on where we live, and just understanding that in the interconnectedness of humanity. Uh, there's people of all kinds of ethnicities with different struggles, and it's important. I think Cindy mentioned she lives in a certain area where there's only Latinos or Hispanics, um, and I, to some degree, also live. I live in Downey, and but where I grew up in the Athens area of Los Angeles. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with that area. All of my friends were Black,
Like Athens Park and things like that?
I'm sorry?
Like Athens Park in South Central?
Yep. So I went to school at Henry Clay Middle School, Woodcrest Elementary. I mean, that's 103rd in Normandy. I mean, South Central, and an area that has been historically redlined. And I never knew the impacts of redlining until I grew up as an adult, and how a lot of what I saw just living in Los Angeles, to some degree, you're frustrated, because it's I had never gone out of South Central for a long time, and the way things were, and my childhood wasn't like, I mean, it wasn't terrible, but it definitely, had some harsh aspects to it, and I think understanding, okay, why are people here a certain way, and I guess, like I said, once I learned about redlining and things like that, and it just really dawned on me, and I think one of the things that I wrote about in my journal was in regards to the goals of Black studies is one of the most recent events that I can think of is like in 2020, when I stood outside of my during quarantine. I stood outside of my house, and I remember not being able to hear a single thing. Like, it was so quiet, it was scary quiet. But then on May 25th, that was the day that George Floyd was killed. And after that, like, there was just a palpable sense of what was going on outside. I mean, you could hear protests and things like that, and understanding, like, people are upset. And some people, I at least on social media, I saw, why are people so upset? The guy, blah blah blah. But it's like, you got to understand, it's not one person that is going through this. It is a history of time and time and time again of feeling that anguish of just society, kind of white society, really putting themselves out on people, and pretending like, this is what things should be like. And so there's frustration, and it's totally understandable. I mean, and I think that's one of the goals, is like getting people to really like feel that, like, feel why people are mad. And it's not a one-time thing. It's not an area inner city thing. It's an everywhere thing that has happened over so much time. People are mad and frustrated, and they should be mad. I got mad, so that's just, at least for the goals. I mean, I kind of, Mauricio and Cindy touched on that feeling, and so I felt the importance to, like, yeah, I totally agree with understanding the world as an interconnected web.
Um, Enrique, I want to, there's a documentary that you may find of interest, especially from where you grew up. It's called Bastards of the Party, and it's on YouTube. I'll put it in the chat. Bastards of the Party. And it's a dude who grew up in Athens Park. His name is Bone, and he's one of the original, not the original, he's one of the first generation or second generation of the Athens Park's Bloods. And he talks about the history of gangs and the social dynamics that make gangs what they were, and really the social dynamics that evolved gangs as organizations for protection for Black communities into what we know them as now. So I would offer, and really anybody online, if you watch that and you do a journal entry for that documentary, I'll give you extra credit for that. It's called Bastards of the Party, and before we leave, I'll put that in the chat, and I'll try to find the link for YouTube as well. Cindy or Mauricio, did any of you want to add to Enrique's discussion about what you all discussed in the breakout room?
Sure, like reading parts of the chapter for the second week, to me, what I got is the Africana studies is like to tell people, especially Blacks, about they weren't just slaves back in the day, you know, that they have a positive Asian culture background, you know, and that's kind of what like instilled in me by my dad when he went to school in Mexico. They told him about their Mexican heritage, where they came from, how the Spaniards conquered them, but how civilized they were before that, you know. So teaching you, I guess some of those so far second week, just knowing about the ancient Egyptian Black culture, it makes you think that, okay, they have a positive background culture, not just being slaves and trying to break away from that, that you were pretty much dominated by the white man, and them teaching you the white man's way of life is pretty much their way, you know? So I guess learning some of the culture from the Africana studies would tell you there's something different out there they're not teaching you.
Yeah. Perfect, thank you, Mauricio. That's really profound. And Enrique put the link to Bachelor at the Party in the chat, so, and that is the correct link, so thank you, Enrique. Cindy, did you want to add to that, or do you want to just jump into the notes? Or to my notes, excuse me.
I just want to say something regarding what are your thoughts on the goals of Black Studies? I feel like I wasn't raised around a lot of people of color. So learning, you know, and understanding other people that have been through other stuff and have seen other stuff makes me realize like how important it is for us to study, you know, Black history in general. I feel like I was just raised here in, you know, in a small community, and I'm not aware of so many things. I just see it on the TV. So I feel like, you know, learning all these things, even though I've learned them before, I feel like, you know, it's something that even children at elementary school should be learning, you know? I feel like it's not just college or high school. My kids are not aware of, you know, people of color because we don't see anybody here. We're just Hispanic. So I feel like, you know, teaching kids at a young age should be something that, you know, school should be aware as well, you know?
Yeah, so I'm gonna pose a question to you, Cindy. And you said that you're Hispanic, and you're saying you haven't grew up around people of culture.
No, not many.
But by default, you are a people of culture.
Yes, I agree with you.
Right, so you have and I'll even say beyond Hispanic, because if you're talking about Hispanic, you're talking about what Mauricio's pops is talking about when the Spanish came to this indigenous land that is yours and conquered the indigenous people of this land, right? So that's this idea of Hispanic or Hispanol, right? You have an indigenous culture that is rich and is deep. So I wouldn't say that you haven't you didn't come up around people of culture, because you're a person of culture yourself, right?
I agree. Yes.
And if you come around people who look like you and whose culture is like yours, then you are coming up in a culture. Now, it may not be like cultural diversity where you have various cultures where you grew up, but you certainly have a culture, and your children are certainly coming up around people of culture, right? And I think you're absolutely correct. It's important that we have a cross-cultural conversation, right? So I'm informed about indigenous culture and you're informed about African culture. But to me, what's first and foremost is we have to understand the importance of our own culture, right? Like I can't have an informed conversation around culture and not really know Black or African culture, right? I'm gonna be missing out on some things. Just as you all in this classroom, those who have insight into indigenous culture, you're gonna read information and you're gonna be able to make connections and insight based off of what you know about your own culture. Because oftentimes with indigenous people, they find is how similar our historic experiences were. We went through the same shit.
Yeah.
We called it, Black folks called it the plantation, y'all called it the mission. But the institution did the same thing to us. And that's why it's important that we have these cross-cultural conversations that are steeped in the understanding of your own culture. I appreciate everyone's offering. I think it was very insightful, and I could tell that you guys had really profound engagements in the breakout rooms. What I would like to do, if it's okay, is go through my notes on the readings. I combined weeks 1 and weeks 2 for this lecture, just because last week we did the intro lecture, so I'm kind of going to mash up that information. This is the book. You may have this edition or maybe the 3rd edition. It shouldn't be a difference. The only thing that you may find is off is like the page numbers. The author of the book is Maulana Karenga. He is the chair of Africana Studies at Cal State University, Long Beach. He is a giant, a living legend when it comes to Africana thought, when it comes to cultural proficiency. For those who are familiar with the holiday Kwanzaa, Maulana Karenga is the one who came up with Kwanzaa. In the 1960s, there were 2, especially in Southern California, there were 2 organizations that really were jockeying for political power in the Black community. One of them being the Black Panther Party of Self-Defense, under the leadership, of Princess Bunchy Carter. The other was the US organization, US standing for United Slaves. This organization was under the leadership of Dr. Maulana Karenga. United US was a cultural nationalist organization, so that they believed the way for African people to achieve their freedom is to culturally return back to their African heritage, taking on African names, taking on African attire and dress, coming up with African religions, hence Kwanzaa, right? Whereas the Black Panther Party, their thought and their philosophy was based on political power being the mechanism for African people to achieve freedom, right? So things like arming ourselves, things like monitoring the police when they do patrols to make sure that the police aren't harming the citizens, right? So these are the 2 branches of political thought that came to the fore in Southern California. And again, it manifested themselves in the forms of the Black Panthers and the US organization. For those who watch the Bastards of the Party film, you will see how the police, the LAPD, used the divide between those 2 organizations, and they would infiltrate those 2 organizations to create the divide. And what ends up happening is Bunchy Carter gets murdered on the campus of UCLA. If you're familiar with UCLA, you know a lot of their Black studies activities go on in Bunchy Hall. It's a homage to Bunchy Carter, right? But the police have a very strong presence in making sure that this beef turned violent. And what you will see is those tactics that they used against the Black Panthers and the US organization evolve into the tactics that they use against the gangs. And the same tactics that they use against us and Black Panthers is used against the Bloods and the Crips. And if you watch the documentary, you'll get a stronger sense of what I'm saying. So for me, and as you guys will know as we continue through the semester, I'm always attentive to how authors start off their text, right? The introduction, the opening line, the opening paragraph is always insightful, and I always like to kind of place myself there and situate my thinking there for a moment, right? And I'm just going to read the opening paragraph and then go into my notes. Black studies is easily one of the most dynamic, controversial, and important disciplines to develop in the last 4 decades. It came to being in struggle as a part of the African-American struggle in the 1960s for freedom, justice, equality, and power. This unconventional way of asserting itself on campus ignited controversy and conversations that still accompany it. Black studies challenged the structure and functioning of the university, i.e. the racial focus of its knowledge base and instruction, its relations of power, the way it excluded and marginalized people of color, and the irrelevance of its education for liberation and life, which were considered the burning issues at hand by Black studies advocates. So for me, there's a couple of things going on in that paragraph, right? He situates the uniqueness of Black studies, right? One, it's a discipline that's birthed out of struggle, right? And I mentioned the rift that was at play between the US organization, the Black Panther Party for self-defense. And I mentioned that there was a person who got killed on the campus of UCLA. So I'm gonna tie that story to what's being talked about in this chapter, right? So in this meeting, it's the US organization, it's the Black Panther Party. They're on the campus of UCLA to determine what organization will lead the Black Studies Department on the campus of UCLA. They gathered all the student body, all the Black student body who attended UCLA and some community members, right? And they were to vote to determine what group would be heading the Department of African Studies on the campus of UCLA. I believe the Black Panther Party won the vote. Because of them winning the vote, the rift kicked off and Bunchy ends up getting shot. But what I want you all to be attentive to, right? Think about the time. This is the 1960s. There's no such thing as Black studies. There's no such thing of even thinking about Black thoughts on college campuses, right? So for the universities to say, yeah, we'll take on this project of creating a Black studies department, the question automatically arose, well, who's going to teach those courses? UCLA doesn't have educators on campus that are equipped to deliver a Black studies course. So what the community organizers said, well, we'll have people from the community come on campus to teach these courses, hence the Black Panther Party and the US organization, right? So the uniqueness of Africana studies, of Black studies, a studies that's birthed out of struggle, right? So quite literally, political organizations, cultural nationalist organizations were especially in California, right, were the first foremost thinkers when it comes to producing this discipline, right? It didn't come from intellectuals. It didn't come from people in what we call the ivory tower, right? This came from the community. So this situates the uniqueness of this particular discipline. And it says that towards the end of the opening paragraph, right, the way it excluded and marginalized, talking about the university, the way it excluded and marginalized people of culture and the irrelevance of its education for liberation and life, right? So they felt that the education that they were receiving within the university did not equip people of culture for liberty and life, right? So the type of schooling that you're receiving in the institutions like UCLA, like UC Berkeley, like Harvard, like Princeton, they didn't make you a better human being, right? They didn't make you as an African person, as an indigenous person, prepared to take on life as an African or indigenous person, right? So they felt that this needed to be adjusted and this needed to be fixed, right? So this is why they came up with these things, these ideas like Black studies, right? And if you know the history of ethnic studies, Black studies is birthed, and then shortly after that, we have your Chicano studies, and then shortly after that, we have Asian studies. Black studies and women and gender studies come to the scene kind of around the same time. But because of the thrust of Black studies, you have other ethnic groups able to situate themselves as a discipline within the university also. So what is a discipline, right? And Karenga articulates discipline as a specialized branch of study and knowledge, right? So this is what a discipline is. It's a specified or specialized branch of study and knowledge, right? Black studies is a discipline. So Black studies is the critical and systemic study of Black thought and practices of African people in their current and historical underlyings, right? So we're not only focusing on what African people were doing in the past, right? We're also concerned with African future and how African people will shape their future. He also provides us with this concept, the diaspora. Has anyone heard, prior to reading this, has anyone heard of the term diaspora before? No? Okay, so diaspora is defined as the scattering of people from a common origin. Right. So in this context, we're dealing with the African diaspora. So the common place of origin is Africa, right? So for those who live in Jamaica, they may consider themselves Jamaicans, but in my estimation, they're Africans who were transported to Jamaica, right? For Africans who are living in the America, who we may call African Americans, in my understanding, we are Africans who are in America, right? We have been migrated or transported to the Americas, right? Africans living in Asia and Europe, those are African people in Europe, African people in Asia. This is what makes up what we call the diaspora. Now, one of the myths I need to destroy as it pertains to the diaspora, oftentimes people understand specifically the African diaspora, right, as a creation of enslavement, right? So the only way that the people of African descent got to Jamaica was because of slavery. The only way the people of African descent got to the Americas was because of enslavement, right? And I want to tell you that that's far from the case. I think last week we mentioned Abu Bakr II, the brother of Mansa Musa, who sailed to the Americas 2,000 years prior to Columbus. Did we talk about that? So remember Mansa Musa from our lecture last week, the richest man on the planet still to this day, right? He's out of Mali. His brother, Abu Bakr II, who was also a king of Mali, he made a pilgrimage to the Americas, right? And this pilgrimage is documented at least 200 years prior to Columbus's arrival to the Americas. In fact, if you read journals from Christopher Columbus on his travels to the Americas, he'll tell you that he had West African men on the ship helping him navigate his way from West Africa to the Americas, right? There's direct currents, water currents in the Atlantic Ocean that will take you straight from West Africa to the eastern part of the Americas, right? So there's a very large African presence here in the Americas prior to America even being America. In fact, this book here, They Came Before Columbus by Ivan van Sertima, The African Presence in Ancient America, it details in great detail and specificity the African presence here in the Americas. And what's important about this book, it doesn't talk about African peoples taking over indigenous culture. It talks about how these two communities were able to come together and produce new culture, right? And this is what I mean when I say knowing your ancient indigenous culture and me knowing my ancient African culture allows for spaces and conversation to develop that lets us know that we're a lot more similar than we think that we're different, right? In fact, there's historic evidence of us building cultures and community together, right? So this is idea of the African diaspora, right? The scattering. And we must know that the scattering did not take place because of enslavement, right? If anything, the enslavement was an interruption in the scattering, or it caused what we call forced migration, okay? He offers this idea of the activist intellectual as an important component to the discipline of African studies. Let me ask you all, why do you think, especially when you think about Africana studies being a discipline that evolves out of struggle, right? And I provided you all with examples of how it comes out of this struggle. Why do you think for Karenga and advocates of Black studies that it's important for practitioners of Black studies to be an activist intellectual? Why do you think that is important? Well, first of all, what is an activist intellectual? And then why do you think it's important for advocates of Black studies to be activist intellectuals?
I think it's probably, to kind of, in other words, it's to walk the walk, in that sense. And I think, especially when you're breaking through previous social norms or previous labels, or you really have to actively change that, kind of like what you're doing in the class. And you're like, one of the things that stick out to me is what you said, we're not going to call anybody slaves, they were enslaved, and which is Yeah, because nobody willingly wants to go through what they went through. So I think that's what what he's saying is they have to kind of, you know, actively change and be about what the study is, or the academia is.
Absolutely. Does anyone else want to add to that? You're absolutely right, Enrique, but if anyone else wants to add, please feel free. Okay, so one thing I do want to kind of circle back to what Enrique said. He said you got to, you know, like walk the walk, right? Like you can't just be about talking these theories, but you also have to practice these theories, right? And this goes into this idea of praxis, 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 right? That's taking the theory and applying it to real life circumstances, right? And this is also a fundamental aspect of the discipline. But through his offering, Karenga's offering of the activist intellectual, right? He also provides us with this concept of ma'at, M-A-A-T, ma'at, right? And he says that the activist intellectual, or what he calls the sheesh, S-E-S-H, which is concerned with taking knowledge to improve the state of the world, right? Through the practice of ma'at. And ma'at is truth, justice, harmony, balance, order, reciprocity, propriety, right? The 7 principles of ma'at: truth, justice, harmony, balance, order, reciprocity, propriety, right? So the activist intellectual's job is to develop intellectual theories that will place ma'at into practice in the society, right? So if you're going to change the way that society operates, by default, you have become an activist, right? And their mechanism for doing this is through an intellectual practice or a theory. And this is why, to Enrique's point, right, you have to be able to walk the walk that you're talking. You have to be able to fuse the theory with a practice that can improve the lives of people. This is this idea of the activist intellectual. This is this concept of infusing the society with this idea of ma'at, right? He also mentions the idea, or African's concept of learning is not to gain knowledge for knowledge's sake, right? It's to gain knowledge for human sake. So we're going to gain knowledge to improve the human condition, right? I'm gonna run through the relevance of the discipline. I'm gonna kind of go through those really quick. The first relevance is to solve the problem of the Black community, society, and world, right? The second relevance is a revolutionary struggle that's being waged to end racist oppression, right? And again, we're going back to this idea of activism, right? Because if you're talking about revolutionizing things, if you're talking about eliminating systems of oppression, you're talking about the work of activists, right? The importance of Black studies and their goals. You know, again, I'm sorry, you know, that's the notes from earlier. Excuse me. So there are academic concerns, right? One of which is this idea of Afrocentricity, right? So we have all. Well, let me ask you this: what is Afrocentricity? Can anybody kind of provide me a working definition for what you feel Afrocentricity is? So we have all. I'll say it like this. Let's go back to last week's lecture, and I asked you, name for me an African individual prior to European contact. And it was hard for us to name that individual. But I said, yo, y'all know who Socrates is, y'all know who Plato is, right? So what this demonstrates, we have been thoroughly imbued with Eurocentricity, right? We've all experienced a Eurocentric educational paradigm. That's why we can speak to Socrates and Plato and all these European thinkers. We know that George Washington never told a lie, right? We know that Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, right? We know these European figures with great emphasis. So we're familiar with the Eurocentric telling of the world. But what Africana studies advocates for is an Afrocentric telling of the world. And the Afrocentric telling of the world will say, yeah, while y'all have Hippocrates over there, Africans, we have Imhotep, right? Who predates Hippocrates by 2,200 years. So what Afrocentricity does, it places the focus from being on European figures to placing the focus on African people and their experiences and their historical unfoldings. Indigenous centric telling of the world would be focusing on the indigenous people and their significant historical phenomena and things of that nature, right? So for Africana studies, it's important that we have an Afrocentric telling of our history and our knowledge, right? One of the social concerns of Black studies is that they're concerned about the Black studies, there's concern about the Black students being turned into vulgar careerists. This is very profound. They're concerned with the students of Black studies being turned into vulgar careerists. I'm going to ask you a question. Jacqueline, welcome to the course. What do you want to do with your education? What's your ultimate goal for your education?
I would say ultimately, like, you mean career-wise or learning-wise?
Whatever you, however you feel, choose to answer that question.
Well, I would like to understand how, I would like to understand equity better. And I would like to kind of use that and find how we lost it in our laws, and kind of bring attention to environmental concerns like environmental racism, that kind of thing.
Okay, so you're what I called an outlier, Jacqueline. You kind of fucked up my experience.
Sorry.
It's all good. You gave good answers. I would prefer that, right? But I want y'all to think about how she first answered the question, right? She said, "Are you asking for my career or for my learning?" Right? And for most people, when you're talking about your schooling experience, you don't separate the two. You're going to school for your career. What I learned, I don't really give a fuck about what I learned. I'm just going to get this degree, to get this career, to get this money, right? This is what they're talking about when they say a vulgar careerist. All you're concerned about is obtaining capital. You don't even care about the knowledge that you're learning. You're not even caring about, as Jacqueline's saying, to try to come up with to do something that will change the state of this world, right? All you're concerned with is your career. And this is one of the concerns of Black studies. They say, we don't want to produce these vulgar careerists. And this is why the activist intellectual is important, right? Because if you think about it, the activist intellectual is the antithesis of the vulgar careerist. Because the activist intellectual's concern is improving humanity, improving society, right? Where the careerists, the vulgar careerists, their concern is just getting the bag. So again, a profoundly unique, different approach to this particular discipline. Also, Jacqueline, as far as you said, you want to find where our laws lost the equity. I would argue they never had it. Let's jump into the basic objectives of the discipline, right? To teach the Blacks in all its to teach Black culture in all its variedness, with special attention to history, culture, and current issues. A second objective is to assemble and create a body of knowledge which contributed to the intellectual and political emancipation, right? So even for them, even from as one of their objectives, right? Knowledge is going to be used to liberate, right? Knowledge will be used to get folks free. And you think about the uniqueness of the African experience, right? Of people who have been enslaved for over 400 years, it would make sense that you're going to have an education that will allow them to free themselves, right? If you come up in an enslaved state, what good is your education if it can't get you free, right? And then they want to create intellectuals who were dedicated to community service and development, opposed to that vulgar careerism. So this is one of the objectives of the discipline. Cultivating, maintaining, and continuing expressions and developing relationships between campus and community. So again, they want to be able to expand the type of work that goes on strictly within the campus and have that branch out into the larger Black community, right? This is what I would say, what Fred Moten calls Black study, right? So what we're talking about as the discipline is Black studies, S-T-U-I-D-E-S, right? S-T-U-D-I-E-S, studies, right? But Black study, S-T-U-D-Y, according to Fred Moten, is the studying of Black behavior anywhere Black folks is found, right? It doesn't have to happen within the classroom. So you see two brothers hanging out on the corner, sipping, talking their shit, that's a location of Black study, right? You see Black women in the hair salon getting their hair done, getting their nails done, talking their shit, that's a location for Black study. The Black church is a location for Black study, right? So what an objective of the discipline of Black studies is to be able to expand the classroom so it can incorporate the community as well, right? Are there any questions about anything I've covered so far? So I know I'm kind of moving a little fast. Okay.
I posted one real quick. It was just really regarding vulgar careerists, and I said, is the problem of creating vulgar careerists specific to American society, according to Karenga or Black studies?
That's a really good question. So I'll answer it this way, Enrique. If you look at the overall goals of Black studies, right, it's kind of like an echo chamber or a ripple effect, right? They want to adjust the things within Black culture, and hopefully that will spill out to be able to adjust the way the overall society works as a whole, right? So he recognizes that, yeah, this vulgar careerism is a problem for all of us, but let's address it within this community first, because one, this is the range of power and influence that we have, right? And then if we're able to, by changing how we move through the world, change the world as a whole, then yes, that's what we want to do. But to answer your question concisely, right, it's a problem for both. And he recognizes the problem for both, but at the same time, I believe being wise about how you spend your energy, right? Like, let's just kind of control our sphere of influence and then branch out from there, if that answers your question. It's a good question though. And I would offer also, right, like the capitalist culture, it produces that vulgar careerism. It's a byproduct of capitalism, right? So to me, even more than this being a racial component or a racial issue, this is a class issue, right? And it's a class issue that cuts across all classes, because the hella wealthy folks become byproducts of vulgar capitalism, and the poor are byproducts of vulgar careerism, right? You're absolutely right, bro. Spot on. It's capitalism, point blank, period. Yep. And it's a byproduct of capitalist culture, right? Because capitalism itself, it has a culture to be individual, to put my needs before anyone else's, to feel like you're in a competition because there's not enough resources, right? That's part of the capital culture, the capitalist culture. And the discipline of Africana studies wants to move us as a society away from that. So the goals, critical and persistent search for truth and meaning in human history and social reality from an African view. 2, a depthful intellectual grasp and appreciation of the ancient, rich, varied, and instructive character of African culture. 3, rigorous intellectual challenge and alternatives to established order ways of viewing social and human reality, right? So they want to challenge the way the status quo, right? We want to not take these normative understandings of the way that the world should work and accept them as true, but we want to challenge them and see if we could come up with something better. For example, our conversation of capitalism, right? That's us challenging our status quo. So why is it that we can't create a society where everyone has housing, everyone has food, everyone has clothing, right? Is it that we don't have enough money? It can't be that, because America just prints money wherever the fuck they want to, right? So it can't be a question of not having resources. It's a question of us not seeing a broader vision of humanity, right? Yep, and that's another thing, right? He says America calls that socialism or communism. But here's a trick back with that, Enrique. Everyone in America loves Bernie Sanders, right? Right? He's widely accepted. Everybody fuck with Uncle Bernie, right? He runs on a socialist platform. Free education, that's a socialist principle. Universal healthcare, that's a socialist principle. So America they're okay with the programs, but they're afraid of the word, right? How many of y'all got free lunch in K through 12 education, right? Right? That's a socialist principle. So you're okay with that, but you better not say the S word, right? Don't say the C word, communism. But yeah, give my son some free lunch, give my daughter free lunch, right? So we have to be able to understand, separate the fallacy of these terms like socialism from what they do for humanity, right? Number 4, a moral critique and social policy corrective for social constraints on human freedom and development. To me, this is very important. So one of the goals of Africana studies as a discipline is a critique and a corrective, right? So by default, what the disciplines to do is critique things that are going wrong in our society, right? We're a hyper war-driven society. We need to critique this, right? Biden is sending all this money to Ukraine, but there's people in our country who are homeless. This should be critiqued, right? So this is the job of the discipline, is to offer critiques, but then also not to only offer the critique, but also a corrective, right? So I'm not going to say what you're doing wrong, but I'm going to offer you some ways to correct what you're doing wrong. So these are the twofold approaches that the study of the discipline of Black studies has toward approaching society and life, right? To critique and to correct. And then finally, a commitment and contribution to the human project of creating truly multicultural, democratic, and just society and good world, right? And so this kind of goes back to Enrique's question in the sense of, is it just focusing on the vocal careerism of Black folks, or is this an overall project? And I think the final goal of Africana studies speaks to the idea that, yeah, we're concerned with getting our people in order, right? But at the end of the day, our overall goal is to address the needs of humanity, right? And I am under the impression, I always believe, that if you help the least among us, everyone rises, right? So if we are to focus on homelessness, right? And you are to address those who are most impacted by homelessness, that's going to improve the social condition for everyone, right? So this can be argued, but I would posit, and again, you guys don't have to agree with me, it could be debated. I would posit though, African people are the most historically oppressed people in this country, right? So if this is to be true, improving the conditions of African people will by default improve the conditions of everybody, right? And you see an example of this through the production of Africana studies, right? Because African people fought and struggled for Africana studies, you now have Chicano studies, you now have Asian American studies, you now have Arab studies, you have Pacific Islander studies. So again, helping the least among us only improves the conditions for all of us. So those will be my notes. I just want to open up for any other questions, comments, concerns, anything that comes to mind. And we'll end class with your final thoughts. So that's going to be like the structure of these voluntary meetings. We'll hop on, I'll address any questions that you all may have. I'll send you into breakout rooms. We'll come back, talk about what you all talked about in breakout rooms, and then I'll go over my notes to kind of help clarify some possible questions that you may have had about the material. Does this work, as far as the structure wise, does this work for you all? Is there anything that you would feel could be done better, or we could talk about that too? Yeah.
This works.
Okay, cool. And I'll continue to do, as long as y'all show up, I'll continue to do it. But if people ain't showing, then I could save my morning. But as long as y'all come, we'll do this. Is there any question about the material or about anything that I've covered, or any questions about that? Jacqueline, do you have any questions overall about just like assignments or anything? Because I know you came in a little bit late. Okay. So if long as there's no other questions, we'll call it a day. I'll probably by the end of the day tomorrow, I'll have this recording posted on our campus site, so that way you can revisit it if you need be. It's also going to be a resource for those who aren't able to attend these meetings. You could always hit me up if you have like questions and you want to set up a one-on-one Zoom. I'm open to do that too. Just whatever you need from me, I'm here as a resource to help you all out. Start thinking about your questions for the paper though, like what question that you want to deal with that can evolve into a paper. And then if you have ideas, just shoot them to me and we can discuss those also. All right, y'all. Be healthy, be wealthy, be wise. Get your exercise, get your water, get your vitamin D, and I will see you all next week. Peace.
Thank you, Professor.
You're
All
welcome.
right, see ya.
All right, Arshel, have a good one.